Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're talking about tips for tough conversations with loved ones. And I have 7 tips written here on my notes. I did a short video on Instagram about this topic, and then I added a little bit more to this list because I think that's really the question I get a lot from my clients and people that I work with is, okay, as I'm changing, as I'm growing physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, healing, evolving, learning, growing, all the things, and I'm learning how to express that and express the change and who I am. How do I have this kind of tough dialogue with people in a way that makes like the person I'm becoming proud, but can also potentially preserve the relationship, especially if you want to, right? When we change and grow, not everybody comes into that next chapter with you. You can expect loss in terms of like friendships, sometimes relationships and things like that. That's part of like the shedding process. But these tips are specifically for people that we love, people we want to communicate with for connection, people that we want to preserve those relationships with. And these are some tips that just, have really worked for myself, for my clients. And I like to go for walks, like brainstorming walks. And so some of these extra ones I added to my notes when I was like on one of those walks. Okay, so tips for tough conversations with loved ones. Number 1, remember you love them. Get yourself in a loving state, whether that means going for a walk, doing some meditation, some heart-opening meditation, some breath work, some maybe visualization of a moment when you were with that person and having just such a really good time, something that really reminds you, hey, I love that person. I don't want to hurt them. Let me get myself into a loving, open-hearted state. There's a podcast or a meditation that I love that's available on YouTube. It's from Dr. Joe Dispenza. It's called Go Love 20. And it's like a 15, 20-minute meditation that's all about just loving this person, picking a person and just sending them lots of love. So I'll post that in the show notes, the link to that YouTube video, in case you think that will be a helpful resource. Because for me, it's a really helpful resource. So number 1, get into that loving state before you have the conversation. And even like, as you know, that conversation might be approaching and you're going to be in the situation to then have the conversation, maybe in the days, weeks leading up to it, check your heart posture, right? Get your heart right. Make sure that you remember that you love them and you get yourself into that state before having that conversation. And if you can, even leading up to that conversation. Number 2, make sure you're not projecting onto them stuff that you're actually bothered about within yourself. Let me say that again. Make sure you're not projecting onto them stuff that you're actually bothered about yourself. So oftentimes we can get frustrated with other people when they do things that actually, if we were really to look within and get really real with ourselves, it's stuff that we don't like about ourselves, or things that we judge ourselves on, or things that we kind of put ourselves down for, right? So check your heart posture, get in that loving state and be like, okay, am I annoyed with that behavior? But can I see that in me? Like, do I need a mirror moment where it's like I need to look at myself in the mirror and be like, yeah, what I was about to call them out for and like, have a conversation with them about, it's actually more about me. And even though, it's a quick tip and this episode is going to be quick, that uncovering process and that ownership process, that Taylor Swift moment I always talk about, it's me, hi, I'm the problem, it's me. It's not always easy. So not here to call anybody out as much as calling you in to think like, okay, is this something that I'm getting frustrated about that I actually need to clean up in my life? Okay, that's number 2. Just like check yourself a little bit. So number 1 was like check your heart, get your heart in check. And number 2, check yourself. Number 3, practice. Practice the tough conversation ahead of time. Whether that's, I like to put on my headphones and then go outside and go for a walk. And that way people that are walking around me probably think I'm like on the phone or having a conversation with actually a person, but really I'm probably not most of the time. I'm actually like talking to myself and practicing what I want to say and how I want it to come out. I remember having a challenging conversation with a close friend and I practiced a lot. I practiced for myself a lot, like just walking and getting out the words. I practiced also because when you practice saying it and like standing up and embodying kind of, yeah, like that physical embodiment of the conversation, getting it out with words, a lot of those feelings will start to come up too, whether that's, if you're a little bit nervous or afraid of, their reaction or what they might think, or like some of those limiting beliefs of like, if I tell them really how I feel, then they're not going to love me, like whatever. Those kinesthetic feelings come up when we practice. And it's kind of like getting ready for game day, right? Like you practice so that when you go out and it's game day, like you're used to a lot of the nerves, your words come out a little bit better, your body language is more open and just nourishing to the conversation. Yeah, I'll choose that word, nourishing to the conversation. You've practiced, you've rehearsed, right? And sometimes it's cool for yourself. And then sometimes it's nice to share it with somebody that you love, like a friend or your partner or a family member or someone where you're like, hey, this happened and here's what I want to say. What do you think? Right? Get a little bit of feedback on that. So that's number 3, practice. Number 4, tips for tough conversations with loved ones. Write it out. And also maybe share that with a friend that you trust that can give you some feedback. So I really find that having tough conversations written out first can be so helpful. I have written, 7 to 13 page letters to people typed out, just getting out all the things, all the hurt, all the feels, only to have a very clear, beautiful, and concise, hour-long conversation with that person because I had really practiced and processed it and got it all out. I think people really underestimate the power of writing, especially writing pen to paper, but even typing out. It's a very good release. I remember recently wanting to communicate something important to a friend. And so I typed out what I wanted to say. And then I actually sent it to my best friend, Allie. And I was like, hey, what do you think? And she was like, okay, that's good. Like good, right. And she's like, that's for you. Like that's yours for your healing journey. Now let's take out like 3/4 of it and you can send that as a text. So that felt really good to write it out, to get it out to a close friend and share that with her. But then she was also able to give me feedback of like, and in my opinion, very good feedback. I love my friend. Shout out to my best friend, Allie. She was like, that's for you. Now let's shorten it down. Let's condense it. And like, all those details are not necessary, but they were necessary for me to admit and to get out and to process and to put on paper, because it's kind of like when a kid thinks that there's a monster, in the closet, and you turn on the lights and you open up the closet and you're like, there's nothing there. It's like being able to get it out and put words to how you're feeling and whatever. It makes those monsters not as scary. And yeah, I just think writing has helped so much. And you know what? Sometimes tough conversations is like a side note. Sometimes tough conversations don't get to happen because maybe that person's no longer alive, no longer in your life, whatever. What's been really helpful for me is writing letters to myself from that person saying what I would want to hear. And I know that might sound bizarre and delusional, but it is so helpful to tell yourself, give it to yourself first. And something is very cool about writing Dear London and signing it from the person that I kind of maybe was holding on. Like, I wish they would say that. It's like, no, girl, just tell yourself and pretend like it's from them and sign it that way. It's been very helpful. Writing is such a powerful tool that I love for my life and I love for the lives of my clients. Okay. Number 5, remember your core values and be sure that you're being who you say you want to be in this conversation, especially when it feels hard and it feels unfamiliar. Because if you're not used to communicating this way and being this way, it might feel very unfamiliar. If you're used to having every conversation be a confrontation and it needs to be a blowout, it might be a little bit unfamiliar to be like, okay, what does like calmness, honesty, serenity do in this conversation while still making connection and still like making a point or still making sure that that person understands why that conversation needed to be had even when it's really tough. And so core values is one of the things I do almost immediately with my one-on-one clients because it's important to know your rules to your game so you can win. Who do you want to be? Who are you becoming? How do you know when you're being that? How do you know when you're not being that? And how do you know when it's time to set a boundary surrounding your core values? I also talk about this in my course. There's a whole module on it, my course, online course, Level Up Your Language, Level Up Your Life, how to go from talker to communicator. I do a whole module on core values. And I even say in that course, and I'll say it here too, if I was going to coach on one thing for the rest of my life, it would be core values and teaching people how to choose who they want to be and actually build integrity and build in those reps to actually be who they say they want to be. So make sure as you're preparing for this tough conversation, you ask yourself, how would honesty show up in this situation if honesty happens to be one of your core values? How would integrity show up in this conversation, right? And look at your core values. If they're written down, I highly suggest that you have them written down in a place that you can easily access, but like double check, right? Like reconsult who you said you wanted to be and those core values. So as you're preparing for that conversation, you stay in integrity with those values. Number 6, it's not about convincing, it's about connecting. I say this a lot. It's not about convincing. It's really about that connection that we get within conversation. You don't have to prove your point. You don't have to be right. And also, I remember in a particular conversation I had with a close friend, and I was sharing a lot of what was on my heart. And it was hard because, it was just really clear and setting boundaries and just like, it was just very challenging to say the least, and very, raw and profound and powerful, right? These conversations are super, super real. And I remember saying to her, because this is a totally valid point, right? I'm not trying to convince her. I remember saying, like, you don't have to agree with me. Like, you can tell me I'm wrong. I've done a lot in my past too that maybe you want to point out. Like, you can tell me, like, no, London, whatevs, peace out, right? I have to get right with the fact that a person can say no if I make a request in this particular conversation. They can be like, whatever, London, like, fuck you, bye. Like, no way. That's not who I am. You've got it all wrong, right? So being able to remember, hey, in this conversation, it's not about my desired outcome. Yes, get real with your desired outcome, which is hopefully, to be more connected with somebody that you love. But you can't be attached to the person saying like, yes, no, or okay, you're right, in order for that conversation to, let's say, be successful. So being able to say like, hey, and feel free to like push back if you want. Feel free to say I'm wrong and you disagree. I get that, but this is really from my heart and I love you and I want to be your friend, So that's number 6. Number 7, try again. Dust yourself off and try again. Seriously, try again, especially when you have mutual respect and love for one another. Embrace that do-over. Okay. If it's somebody that you're close with, if it's your partner, if it's someone in your family, your coworker, a close friend, and you're like, no, this relationship matters. And like, shit, I didn't do a good job. Try again. Right? People still reserve the right to set boundaries surrounding your do-overs, right? Like if in their model of the world, you've tried and failed to communicate them within a way that's not cool, they can set up a boundary. And I think that friends that are really, really close and relationships that are really close that believe in who you are and who you're becoming, allowing those do-overs on both sides, right? There's some times where I notice I'm like, no, I'm not going to allow the do-over, but it's like, no, it's important to allow the person to be like, that's not what I meant. Here's actually what I meant. And thank you for allowing me to try again and to do over. I can think of many do-overs with my family members, my mom and my dad. So grateful that in this process of relearning how to communicate with them in a new way, they've allowed me a ton of do-overs. And I think it's really beautiful to try again. So those are the 7 tips for having tough conversations with people that you love. Remember that you love them. Check your heart. Make sure you're not projecting onto them stuff that you're actually bothered about within yourself. That's number 2. So check your heart, check yourself. Number 3, practice. Number 4, write it out. Number 5, remember your core values. Number 6, remember it's not about convincing, it's about connecting. And number 7, try again. Come back to the arena to have those tough conversations. It's not going to be perfect every single time, and embrace the do-over.